New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we'll be exploring the life of Peter D. Ouspensky, and we'll look at the Gurdjieff work as well. My guest is Gary Lachman, who is the author of In Search of P.D. Ouspensky, the Genius in the Shadow of Gurdjieff. Gary is also the author of some 20 other books regarding the history of esoteric culture, ranging from Hermeticism to Theosophy to Anthroposophy to ceremonial magic to the writings of Swedenborg and the psychology mystic Carl Jung. This interview has been conducted via the internet, so now I will switch over to the internet channel. Welcome, Gary. It's a pleasure to be with you once again. We've covered a lot of the major esoteric teachers of the 19th century, and today we're going to look at the unusual relationship between Peter Ouspensky and George Gurdjieff. I think it's fair to say that they both had a enormous influence on 20th century spirituality and esoteric culture.
Absolutely. And yes, thank you for having me on once again, Jeffrey. Gurdjieff and Ouspensky are up there with people like Blavatsky, who's the 19th, and Steiner, and others around. But I come to call sort of the golden age of modern esotericism, because they were sort of all operating the early 1920s. You have practically all these people operating at the same time. Mm-hmm. But yeah, Gurdjieff and Ouspensky are absolutely central to a great many developments at that time, and then later, even today, but later in the 1960s and 70s and so on. I mean, I first came across Ouspensky, who's a Russian who was born in 1878 in Moscow, and when I was reading Colin Wilson's book, The Occult. I mean, once again, all of the stuff starts there for me, and along with other people he's talking about in his book, he's referring to Ouspensky frequently, and there's a section, sort of half a chapter on Gurdjieff, and Ouspensky's in there as well. But at the very beginning of the book, he refers to a book of Ouspensky's called New Model of the Universe. And there's a story that Ouspensky tells in there when he was working as a journalist in Moscow and St. Petersburg in the pre-Bolshevik days, the early 20th century. And he's writing for different newspapers then. And he has to write something about the Hague Conference. And this was kind of something before the League of Nations. And it was kind of a pre-World War I attempt to somehow, reach some kind of agreement among all the nations that would soon be at war, or something along those lines. And it's something he has to do, but he just keeps putting it off, and it's really boring, and he doesn't want to do it. And he talks about having a drawer in his desk in his office where he opens it, and inside it are all these occult books. Books by people like Steiner or Annie Besant and Charles Leadbeater and others of that time, his contemporaries, really. And around this time, Ouspensky was probably in the Theosophical Society in Russia. I think he joined about 1907, and I think he left just before World War I. But he says how something about the mystery and the magic and the wonder that's inside these books is more real to him than this hard reality of political world that he has to deal with and write about. And he says something like, "Oh well, one more article, loss won't be too great for the world," or something like that. And he talks about how it goes off. And Wilson talks about how he too, when he was a young man, and he came across books like Ouspensky's In Search of the Miraculous, which is his famous account of his years with Gurdjieff, and other books, how he too felt something like that. And then I was reading that, and I'm saying, well, I'm feeling the same thing reading your book. And it led me to go seek these books out. And one of the first books I did find was that book by Ouspensky, New Model of the Universe. And it's a remarkable just compendium of different chapters and essays about a variety of different occult and esoteric and scientific and psychological things, dreams, the nature of time. I'm sure we'll get into this, but this was one of Ouspensky's central mysteries, and consciousness, and this whole notion of esotericism, this whole idea that there is another kind of knowledge that has existed throughout history, but we in the modern age have lost touch with it. And that's just sparked this whole sense of mystery in me, and pretty much sent me off on my own journey, my own path into winding up what I'm doing now.
Mm-hmm. I think it's fair to say that Ouspensky, writing sort of on the brink of the First World War, must have had a sense that the social order, the political order simply wasn't working, and it wasn't under anybody's control, that a war could break out and there would be no stopping it and no controlling it, and it's as if the human beings were powerless over their own fate.
Well, this was something that he says that he came to an understanding of quite young. He talks about when he was a little boy and with his older sister, how they used to sort of look out the window and look at things. And he talks about this book he had called Obvious Absurdities, and it would be a picture of a man carrying a house on his back, or a cart with square wheels. And he says how he didn't understand why the things just outside the window weren't considered just as absurd as the sort of stuff that he was seeing in this book. So he said he has this sense of this as you say, this kind of strangeness about life, where things seem to happen no matter what people do, or people are not in control, and there's all this sort of thing. And this is something that led him on this search for the miraculous that he went on in the early 20th century when he was a journalist, and he secured commissions from different newspapers in Russia to go to India, to go to Egypt, to go to the Holy Lands and places of that sort, and Ceylon and all this sort of thing. And his whole idea was he was going to be writing articles about this, and this sort of funded his travels. But he was really in search of discovering people, from whom he can learn things. Schools. He talks about the search for schools. And again, it's a familiar, trope. Gurdjieff himself later tell Ouspensky about his own journeys in Central Asia in search of, hidden knowledge. And before them, both of them, Blavatsky did the same sort of thing. And so Ouspensky is doing this. And the difference is that he returns from these journeys and he feels that he hasn't really found anything. He came back a bit disabused of this romantic sense of schools, and even this is one thing I loved about Ouspensky too, is that he's very, very critical of himself. And he's a very good writer too. He's one of the best writers in this whole esoteric sort of genre. But he's very self-critical, and so he sort of sees this romanticism in himself, and he sees how he's had extravagant ideas about making contacts on the higher planes and things of that sort. And the irony is that when he comes back to Russia, he meets the master who knows in his own backyard, practically, and that's Gurdjieff.
At the time Ouspensky met Gurdjieff, he was already a renowned person in Russia. His first book, Tertium Organum, received a lot of critical acclaim.
Oh, absolutely, and it's precisely because of that that Gurdjieff sought him out. There's a story that Gurdjieff told two of his students. He told all of his students to, follow what this man's doing, read his books, read his articles, go to his lectures, that sort of thing. And then he instructed two of his students to ensnare Ouspensky, to basically go and chat him up, meet him, and talk to him, and tell him about us, tell him about what we're doing, and bring him here. I want to meet him. And Ouspensky said his sort of romanticism has been bruised. He's not really interested in meeting any gurus or anything like that. And he's actually come across a reference to Gurdjieff in this advertisement that he winds up, sort of writing a kind of ironic note about this ballet, The Struggle of the Magicians, and he posts it in there. But yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, he was well known, I said, in the Theosophical Society. He gave many talks. He had, thousands of people at talks. When he came back from his journey in Miraculous, when he gave talks about, going to India, going to Egypt, going to Ceylon, standing before the Sphinx and the pyramids and things of that sort. And again, this is at a time when travel wasn't quite as accessible as it is today for everybody. So he was a very early esotourist, you might call, where he's going to these, sacred sites and all this sort of thing. And he's writing both kind of beautiful prose poetry accounts of being before the Sphinx and before the pyramids and Notre Dame and places like that, and then also, rather good travel log kind of thing. And again, behind it all is this idea of this hidden knowledge, this knowledge that we've lost, which is called esoteric, which is about the inner. So yes, and he's Tertium Organum, and earlier books is a book called The Fourth Dimension, which was a craze at the time, similar to sort of like what chaos theory was maybe in the 80s and the 90s. People were all trying to figure out what the fourth dimension was about, and H.G. Wells' Time Machine came out of that. And so he wrote about. He's often presented as a mathematician, but he really wasn't a mathematician. His father was an amateur mathematician. Ouspensky was interested in himself, but he never held any kind of college, university position. He was a dropout. He never got a degree or anything like that. But he wrote about that sort of thing. He was well known.
He was deliberately a dropout. I gather that was part of his philosophy. He didn't want to be known as an orthodox anything.
In his thinly disguised autobiographical novel, Strange Life of Ivan Osokin, which is a story about eternal recurrence, which was Ouspensky's, obsession, the idea that our lives repeat over and over again. And he goes back in the story, a young man who's, had this tragedy and problems and, his life has been shattered and all this. And if only I could go back and change. And he meets a magician who says, well, I'll send you back, but things are going to be exactly the same anyway. But he said, oh no, I'll go. And then he goes, and then obviously the same things happen. But it's what happened in Ouspensky's own life. He got thrown out of school. He was, he was sort of a wise guy, as it were. He was very clever. He was very smart. This is one of the stories also he tells. He got in trouble for reading a physics book, and when he should have been on some Latin lesson or something like that. So he had a very inquisitive mind. And he says he was very aware of himself from a young age. And from a very young age, he had this sense of what we would call déjà vu, the sense that he had been here before. And this was something that he out of that, he developed, other people had talked about it, but he assimilated the ideas of eternal recurrence from Nietzsche and Pythagoras and a variety of other sources. But he developed this whole kind of theory about time, and Tertium Organum is about time too. So he talks about different dimensions. Again, this was another thing that was very popular in the early 20th century. This whole Charles Hinton and the Hinton cubes. And if you know of those, these kind of multi-dimensional kind of Rubik cubes that you can put apart and put together, take apart in your mind and all that. So Ouspensky was writing all about that stuff, and that's precisely because, and that's why Gurdjieff sort of targeted him and said, we have to get him involved in us.
You paint a picture in your book of Gurdjieff as being rather both manipulative in the way that he endeavored to ensnare Ouspensky, and also a fabricator, a person who is always acting, making up stories that you couldn't ever really know if anything Gurdjieff was telling you was true. And on top of that, I suppose he made an effort, I think, to in fact, an extreme effort to belittle everyone around them, tell them they weren't even real, they were nothing, they were pieces of shit.
Well, yes, you're right. Yes, correct to all of the above. I mean, this was part of his teaching strategy. And again, if you look at parallels, I mean, the whole idea of ensnaring Ouspensky, that's something Blavatsky did with Colonel Olcott. She did it herself. She went when Olcott was up in Chittenden, Vermont, and was investigating these spiritualist manifestations, and she read about it and she went in because I think both of them needed a good front man in different ways. I mean, I think not to equate Olcott and Ouspensky, they're different, but they served a similar kind of purpose, I think, with Blavatsky and Gurdjieff. But no, with Gurdjieff's philosophy or his teaching was that we're all asleep. We're all mechanical. We're all machines. We think we have free will, but we really don't. We think we're one single entity, me, I, but we're not. We're legion. We are legion, as we were told already. And you're talking about Ouspensky seeing this world in which all this sort of mad kind of stupid tragedy goes on constantly, these kind of catastrophes going on all the time. Well, he's meeting Gurdjieff just around the start of World War I. And especially for Russia, this was a catastrophe because, the army had men and that's about it. They didn't have that, they were like people who had rifles and no bullets and some of them had no rifles and they were just being, there's a story Ouspensky tells where he sees a truck go by and it's carrying crutches, but therefore limbs that haven't been blown off yet. Mm-hmm. It's sort of in preparation. And so they know in advance X number of people are going to come back, with no legs or something like that. And the idea that people were calculating for that, this kind of horror was the thing that made him think, life is mad. We're all, and he was ready to hear Gurdjieff's message, which, yes, it's very brutal. It seems very demeaning and diminishing, but from his perspective, it's, the only way we will strive to try and get a true freedom is to disabuse ourselves of the sense that we already are free. And the only way we will strive to get real consciousness is to lose this notion that we already are conscious. And again, I guess for Ouspensky, who already experimented a great deal with himself, he has a wonderful chapter in New Model of the Universe called Experimental Mysticism, which is one of the best things ever written about altered states of consciousness. And he's in his room in St. Petersburg, and having read William James, he's experimenting with nitrous oxide and hashish as well, and things of that sort. And it's just a fantastic account of these higher states. So he knows what these things are like, but he also knows that he can't make them happen. Mm-hmm. He has to use these kind of crude methods to do this, and he goes already in search to where you're supposed to go to, learn how to do this, to the East, the mystic East, and that sort of thing. And he comes back empty-handed. And then he meets, Gurdjieff is kind of like, in some ways I equate him with Kazansaki's character Zorba the Greek. He's this kind of man's man. He's earthy, he's tough, he's instinctual, and Ouspensky's an intellectual. He's a romantic intellectual. He's in the world of ideas and art and beauty and poetry. He used to write poetry. He wrote short stories. We know him now, people who, I don't think he's as well known now as he was, say, back in the 60s and 70s or 80s, but we tend to know him as, the teacher of Gurdjieff. We tend to know him as the author of In Search of the Miraculous, which is, still the best, most lucid, clearest account of Gurdjieff's teaching. But before this, as I said, he wrote a novel, he wrote short stories. He actually wrote, some of the short stories are actually kind of funny in places. So he has a different character, and I think somehow, Gurdjieff became his and he said, okay, I'll accept. I'll let you become my teacher, or you'll accept me as your student. There were certain kinds of, sort of conditions and all that. But then, so he submitted in the way that I guess one is supposed to if you're submitting to a teacher. Even if you're going to study something in a university, you have to accept that. Okay, well, and I don't, so I'll learn from you. So he did that, and that was the whole idea, to learn how to experience these things without having to resort to the drugs, or to be able to, make them happen at will, or have them at your own control. And I guess he was convinced that Gurdjieff was right. That yes, for the most part we are not as free and not as awake as we believe we are.
Ouspensky might have been particularly vulnerable to Gurdjieff's influence because he lost his father at an early age. Gurdjieff, even though I think they were roughly the same age, Gurdjieff was like a father figure.
Yes, I'm saying he's kind of this Zorba. If you know Nikos Kazantzaki's novel Zorba the Greek, there's a very sensitive intellectual poet who goes to Crete, and he meets this vital, living, fresh, instinctual character Zorba, who's just man of the earth. He's very much of his instincts and of the moment, in the now. He's not in his head all the time as the poet is. And I tend to think there's something along those lines. And you can sort of see similar with Don Juan and Castaneda. Castaneda and Don Juan, it's still a kind of similar sort of thing. Gurdjieff was a powerful individual. He had a kind of real presence and essence, and he'd done lots of things that Ouspensky wanted to do, or he went to lots of places that Ouspensky had wanted to go to. The first thing, they meet, the famous story, they meet in this back street cafe in Moscow. The last place you'd expect to meet the man who knows. It's frequented by small, kind of business, characters and sort of, traveling salesmen or something like that. And he has this impression, it's a wonderful description where Gurdjieff is sort of he's poorly disguised on purpose so that you will know that he's trying to wear a disguise, but it's so obvious that, do you say something or do you not say something? So it's immediately, Ouspensky he comes from a very cultured family, from the intellectual, part of Russian culture, and all that. And, he's used to a certain way, and he's a very, disciplined, moral kind of character. He was a poet and all that, but he has a very strong sense of, right and wrong and, all the behavior and all that kind of thing. And so suddenly it's like, he's got, some strange trickster character in front of him, and he doesn't quite know what to do with it. So Gurdjieff was, very good at doing that. And he had already had a few years training doing, different experiments with different groups before, he met Ouspensky. I guess the idea was he was ready to go out into the world. He was sort of ready to launch. And so we need somebody like him, to get us out there. And Ouspensky was just impressed. The more they talked, the more he felt that Gurdjieff knows. He knows these things. And he was impressed with the teaching. It seemed the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. It was a difficult teaching to accept. It wasn't something that he just swallowed immediately. He talks about struggle, trying to accept, and, is it really as bad as that, and all that kind of thing. Because he even says, yes, I understand, and I've written books about that. And Gurdjieff basically says, no, your books were written in a state of sleep and mechanicalness as well. And this is something like, well, okay, but really, that would be something very difficult to accept. And so he does that. So Gurdjieff must have been powerfully convincing.
Well, I suppose if you tell somebody you are totally a robot, you are completely a mechanical being, and I see that and I know how you can be freed from this condition, that's a pretty good sales pitch.
Yeah, it is. Once you start thinking, you say, well, if I'm completely a robot, then I can never be free, right? So there must be some small little piece of free will, or whatever you want to call it, that is attracted to what you're saying, and we can start from there. So even that, and Ouspensky knows that and all that, and it's a kind of thing you have to kind of, oh yes, you're right, but the amount we have is so little that if we just sort of take it for granted, we're never going to develop it and all that. But it is, and it's something that other people say. It's not, if you put it in that kind of formula, you are asleep and I will wake you. You can, any number of different sort of spiritual and psychological and psychotherapeutic practices will sort of make that offer. But myself, having been involved for a while in Gurdjieff work in the 1980s, I know some of these things that I experienced were powerful and they were real, and they were enough to convince me that yes, this is about something. It somehow it has a, it's about something concrete. So I haven't practiced everything, so I can't judge it against 25 others, but I know from my own experience that it had that kind of character to it. So it's a specific kind of thing that you have to stay with and follow, and it's a very what do you want to call it? I don't want to say humble. That's not quite the right word. But they keep quiet. It's not something that's advertised very much. It's not something sort of out there. It's something that keeps to itself, and that gives it a kind of gravitas and a seriousness that I think many of these other things lack. But But even Ouspensky, after a while, he, this kind of trickster character of Gurdjieff, where you never quite know what he's doing. He gets a little tired of that. And there's even some other incidences where it really seems to him that Gurdjieff has kind of stepped over certain boundaries and certain lines. And after this, Search for the Miraculous is a fantastic account of Gurdjieff's teaching, but it's also a story of Ouspensky's own journey, and then literally a journey from Moscow and St. Petersburg with, first World War I, then the Russian Revolution, then the Civil War, and they get washed, across Russia down to Turkey, Constantinople at the time. And they were refugees, like refugees today. Ouspensky was considered sort of a white Russian refugee, and he certainly didn't like the Bolsheviks. He absolutely hated the Reds. He thought, this was not the rise of the dictatorship of the proletariat, but the dictatorship of the criminal element and all of that. Not that he cared for the Tsarist regime either, because his young sister was arrested in the 1905 revolution, and she was put in prison, and she never was released. She died in prison, so he didn't have any particular good feelings about the Tsar either. But I'm saying it's this fantastic story. And then, more or less at that point, Ouspensky realizes that he has to split, that he has to separate, the teaching from the man. And, there's a long process of that happening. But you talk about Search for the Miraculous. It's when he's stuck in this white Russian sort of refugee camp in Constantinople, where he suddenly hears that his book, Tertium Organum, had been translated into English. A Russian emigre had managed to get a copy out. And Claude Bragdon, who was a well-known writer and artist and also architect, and he wrote a great deal about the fourth dimension as well, he published this English translation of Tertium Organum, and it was a surprise bestseller in America and then in England as well. And he's contacted by a wealthy wife of one of the great newspaper magnates at the time, and she'll say that she says to him that basically I'm a lover of your book, and I want to meet you, money no expense, wherever you want to be, London or New York. And so where before he was basically working as a porter for a while, and he was kind of teaching English to Russian refugees, he's suddenly lifted out of this refugee camp, and he lands in London in 1921, and people like T.S. Eliot and Aldous Huxley, and A.R. Orage, who will be instrumental in his career and in Gurdjieff's as well, as the editor of the New Age magazine at the time, called The New Age. And he's there, and he's basically having dinner on sort of golden plates with golden kind of cutlery and all this sort of thing. And he's sort of the intellectual flavor of the month. But what they know is Tertium Organum, and they want to hear him lecture about that. But he doesn't. He starts teaching them Gurdjieff's system, and it's a complete shock to everybody at these lectures, because this is not what they wanted to hear.
But I gather he began to build up quite a large following, going from being a refugee in Istanbul to a celebrated author in London. Must have been quite a shock to him.
Shock is a good word. This is part of the Gurdjieff, sort of approach. We sort of need these shocks to wake us momentarily. But this was a very pleasant one. Mm-hmm. And but he himself, he never really took to particularly being a celebrity. I think Ouspensky always kind of he never really hogged the limelight in any way whatsoever. And I think he always kept to the side or kept himself back. And so after a while, he was sort of being touted by different soirees as, I said, the kind of intellectual flavor of the month. People moved on to something else, and he settled in living in a small flat over in West London for quite some time, and just writing, having small groups, just a few people. One of the people that become very involved with him is a fellow named Maurice Nicoll, who started out as disciple of Jung, really. He was Jung's sort of English agent, as it were. And his first book, Dream Psychology, is written from a Jungian perspective. But he hears about Ouspensky and with some other people who he's involved with. There's something called the psychosynthesis group, that they call it. They're studying kind of different approaches to psychology. they go to these lectures, and Nickel is just bowled over, and he comes away from it, and his wife has just had their first child, and he rushes into the room, and he's sort of saying, I found him. This is the man I've been searching for. He's the one who knows. And he had previously sent a prayer to Hermes to say that he was in despair and darkness, and send me the light, or something along those lines. And so he feels that he's met the man who can do that. And he becomes, in the long run, a close friend of Ouspensky's, and eventually he starts teaching his own classes. But about a year later or so, Gurdjieff shows up, and talk about a shock.
In England now.
He has complete, total shock for Ouspensky.
Yeah. Now, you describe Ouspensky in your book as basically having two different personalities that you attribute to his first two names, Peter Damien. And one is a very dour person, which apparently he became later in life. But the early Ouspensky you describe more as a romantic poet, a fellow who loved to hang out in taverns and enjoyed a lot of alcohol. And something changed. His encounter with Gurdjieff caused him to become something of a very different person by the end of his life.
Well, I think that's I think that's true, and I think that's one of the themes in the book. And it was his encounter with Gurdjieff that changed him. And he was a poet. He was a familiar figure at a famous cafe in St. Petersburg called the Stray Dog. And this was in a period in Russia known as the Silver Age. And it kind of starts in the 1890s, and it goes just before World War I, or just before the Bolshevik Revolution. But it's a time of fantastic flowering of art and culture, and a great deal of it of a spiritual, esoteric, occult nature. There's an occult revival going on in Moscow and St. Petersburg, just as there is in Paris and in London at the time. And you have people like, and Rudolf Steiner's ideas are very influential. Steiner had given lectures to audience of Russian intellectuals in the early 1900s, and they brought back a lot of his ideas. So this is all in the air and at these salons. And at this place, the Stray Dog, there's people like the poet Alexander Blok, who's a very famous symbolist poet. Andrei Biely is a symbolist, anthroposophical novelist. His novel, St. Petersburg, is this kind of eerie, strange, weirdly atmospheric novel about this time that has just saturated with a lot of Steiner's ideas and things of that sort. So all this stuff is going on. Ouspensky's familiar in this area, and he knows different poets and different painters and other writers and all that. And he also tells stories that whenever there was a fight going on, they always said, "Oh, go get Ouspensky, and he'll settle it." And he somehow was able to kind of, make things work out between people. And if you know Russian literature, there's this whole kind of strange, weird, slightly absurd, not Kafka, because it just doesn't have this strange dread in the background. It's more like a funny kind of comic absurdity. And the novelist Gogol is a short story writer. He's probably the most, well-known example of this. And Ouspensky has this kind of character when he's telling these stories, and he tells some story about how through some long, night where lots of things happened, one sleeve of his coat got torn off, and he never figured out how did that happen? And it's sort of the thing like the sleeve, the story of Ouspensky's sleeve, and then it turns up someplace else. That would happen in some Russian story. So he's in that sort of milieu, but again, he was a sensitive, romantic character. He had a much more romantic sense about women and sex and all that than Gurdjieff. Gurdjieff was more the sort of, had a harem. This is sort of the stories, and it was not this kind of romantic, poetic kind of relationship or ideas about it. That again is a Russian tradition. The whole idea of Sophia and the woman is kind of like the eternal feminine, and somehow the embodiment or the carrier of this transcendent meaning and all that. And Ouspensky's in that kind of tradition, and so there's all that. And then again, he meets Gurdjieff, who basically is a tougher character. And I think in some way, when Gurdjieff must have the encounter, he must have felt somehow that there was something weak, something small, something vulnerable in him that he had to change or get rid of before he would be able to be awake or be conscious man number 5, 4, whatever it is. And that's another theme in the book, is that that's what happened, because you say he was fond of alcohol. Yes, he was, but But sadly, he was very fond of alcohol in his later life as well. I mean, not to put it too bluntly, but he basically drank himself to death in the end. He became very, very sentimental in the last sort of years of his life in the late 40s when he was in New York, and then it was mostly happening in New York. He was very isolated, or New Jersey. He was in a place called Franklin Farms in Mendham, New Jersey, which is not too far from New York, and he became very isolated there. And that's this is about 20 years on from the period we were last talking about, or 40 years from the Straight Dog Cafe. So yeah, there's this shift where he is this kind of I said, like a romantic philosopher. This is what I liked about when I first read New Model of the Universe, and because I read those first before I read In Search of the Miraculous, or got involved in the Gurdjieff work. And so those are the first books of his that really had an impact on me. And they have this, this sense of mystery and wonder and awe behind everything, and also, all these insights into consciousness. Fantastic chapter on dreams. Ouspensky was an early explorer of hypnagogia, this in-between state between sleeping and waking, where a lot of interesting things can happen, and I've written about that in some of my books, and he has a very interesting chapter about that. And this whole idea of eternal recurrence, and if you're like me, you're a sucker for kind of time theories. It's sort of, okay, how do I understand this? I mean, Nietzsche had talked about that before, but with Nietzsche, it's more of a challenge. It's more like, if in his book, The Gay Science, he says, what if a demon came down and told you this life as you know it now will repeat over and over again exactly as it was, nothing will be different, nothing will change, you'll make the same mistakes, and, the same bad things will happen and whatever. How would you feel about that? Are you tough enough to say, okay, yes, encore, because I've had some moments of joy and beauty and power were meaningful enough for me to, redeem the rest? Or would you just say, oh, oy vey, are you kidding? And so Nietzsche was a kind of gauge, whereas Ouspensky took it more seriously in the sense like, well, how do you get off the wheel? And it wasn't the wheel of reincarnation. And when he talks about reincarnation, he talks about reincarnating into the past in order to change things, which is a very strange idea, too. So he doesn't talk about reincarnation that much. When he does, it's not about, your next life. It's about somehow reincarnating into some past period where you could actually, stop Hitler or something like that. It's very odd. But this whole idea of repetition, and we know that film Groundhog Day with Bill Murray is based on Ouspensky's ideas about eternal recurrence, and so it's seeped into the culture in some way. So yeah, he was all wrapped up in all these kinds of things, and most of that kind of gets put aside during all the Gurdjieff time. And later on, he starts bringing it in sort of in his last kind of days in his lectures. If you read there's collections of question and answers from the different groups he had in New York and London and London and New York and all that. And he starts to bring in some of these things. And Nicol, who's very interested in time as well. And if you ever get a chance, his psychological observations on the teachings of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky are absolutely fantastic reading. I think it's about 7 of them. But it's that teaching that he got from Ouspensky, and then he brings in things as well, things about time, and he was a reader of Swedenborg, and also Jung. There's a lot of ideas about Jung in there as well. So, any case, so there's that. So there was this dry period, and at the end he started to do this other thing. But he just changed, and it's sad. There's a sadness to sort of his last days, and I mean, the book that he's most known for, he didn't even want it to be published. In Search of the Miraculous. I mean, he is sort of what he said about it. He basically said, this is not to be published or something along those lines. And so it was against his last wishes that it got out there. I mean, thank God it did. But he had a very bitter, or not it's bitter. What do you want to say? He questioned a lot at the end. He had a great deal of doubt at the end about the whole thing. And famously, in the last lectures he gave, talk about a shock. He had come back from New York, and he was very, very ill. He was in his last months of his life, and but he famously said at the last gatherings here in London, people asked him about the system. He said, "What system? I don't know of any system. What system are you talking about? Who told you were asleep? Who told you were mechanical? Why did you believe them?" And he repudiated, the thing that he had been teaching for the last 25 years.
I'm curious about the differences in the application of this system between Ouspensky and Gurdjieff. I have the impression from your book that when Ouspensky taught the system, it was very methodical. It involved focus primarily on an exercise known as remembering yourself. Whereas in Gurdjieff's instance, he used many other methods, and Gurdjieff improvised a lot more.
Yeah, I think. Sorry, yes, I think that's exactly right. I mean, Ouspensky taught the system as he had learned it in these years, 1915 to 1919. Gurdjieff, and he developed that. And that he's sort of like Plato to Gurdjieff Socrates, where Gurdjieff sort of did the oral teaching and taught by example and created situations. Ouspensky put it all into this nice system, and it's very lucid. It is very methodical, and it has all the steps in it, and the whole cosmology, the ray of creation, and all that sort of thing. And yes, it's essentially about self-remembering, which more or less is having a vivid sense of your own being. I think it's something that my own experience, it happens by itself sometimes, and there's a whole different series of exercises where you can practice trying to induce it, and there's a variety of other things as well. But yes, when you get to Gurdjieff, it's much more. He sort of not necessarily made it up as he went along, but there is a lot of improv. There's a lot of sort of psychodrama. There's a lot of creating these. He sort of created artificial crisis. In a way, he made situations difficult for people so that they were faced with dealing with their own parts of themselves, their own mechanicalness, their own being. They had to, and the whole idea was to have a sense of your being. I think one of the fundamental things Gurdjieff makes the difference between essence and personality. And essence is what you're born with. It's who you are. It's what you come into the world with. And personality is something we develop in order to survive in the world, or to deal with the world. I mean, you can call it sort of persona and self or something like that in the Jungian system. I think there's, sort of similarities there. But what happens over our life is our personality takes over the essence, and the essence doesn't grow. It remains, more childlike. And the personality turns into this kind of shell or a kind of armor that we wear, and we take it for ourselves, but it isn't really us. And Gurdjieff created situations in which that would be challenged somehow. The limits of yourself, where you thought you extended, how far you went would be challenged. You'd be forced to go beyond those. And the different sorts of things. I mean, he would create these kind of psychodrama situations. Another thing that very famous for were the movements. This is something that Ouspensky really didn't get into. I think he had some sort of, go with them, but it wasn't something that was really, involved. And he was much more in the head, you would say. It's much more sort of a yogi kind of approach, where Gurdjieff, it's physical. And these movements are, I mean, if you ever, that kind of thing, if you ever think about that, you 10 times. Have you ever tried to do them? Have you ever seen any of the films of the practice, the film from late 70s, Meetings with the Remarkable Men, Peter Brook did? There's at the end of it, there's a section where they're performing the movements. And, they're very difficult, they're very precise, they're very rigorous, they're very demanding. And they kind of create... What I came to understand them doing is they sort of create the conditions for second wind. If with athletes, they push themselves and they get to a point where they feel like, oh my God, I just can't do it anymore. And then they just a little bit more, and then there's the extra, tank of gasoline kicks in, and suddenly they can go and do it. And, I think we experience that in different sorts of ways. So again, that's pushing past our limits. We think, oh, I only have that much, but actually you have more. And William James wrote a fantastic essay about this called The Energies of Men, where he talks about the phenomena of second wind. And I saw there were similarities between my own experience of performing the movements many, many years ago, but I certainly there was one time I really felt, yes, this is what this is about. And it was sort of like, I can't do it, and suddenly you find yourself doing it, and you feel full of a lot of energy. And then reading accounts that William James talked about. And so I felt, and Jung had a similar kind of thing, this is what they call the bullying treatment, where you sort of force the patient, you force the person to make efforts that they believe are absolutely impossible, which they aren't. they're quite within their capacity, but they've set up an artificial limit, and they push past it, and they suddenly have, this influx of energy. And so seeing the connection between those things was something that sold me on, because I thought, well, they're all sort of talking about the same thing. They can't all be making it up, and it's really something about, human psychology. So, I'm convinced that Gurdjieff knew, what he was talking about. Whether the way he applied things or, his method of teaching was right for everyone, that's a different thing. And I think I got into some trouble with that with my book, because as you say, I question it, and I question it especially in his relationship with Ouspensky.
Well, Ouspensky, at one point, it's sort of, maybe one point isn't the right word. Over time, Ouspensky came to disassociate himself and his work from Gurdjieff, to the point where he forbade his students to read Gurdjieff's writings or have any direct contact with Gurdjieff.
Yeah, there is this kind of sort of psychodrama that goes on in the history of the work, as it's called, or the Fourth Way. And yeah, this happened. It was in 1924 or so. Gurdjieff, Ouspensky had set up groups in London. Gurdjieff was trying to find a place to land, after getting out of Istanbul, getting out of Constantinople, and he's looking for different places to set up his Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man. And he tries in Berlin, he tries to get into London, but they think he's a Russian spy, all this kind of thing. And actually, the whole time Ouspensky was here, the Home Office had him under surveillance, even though he was, fervently anti-Bolshevik. They somehow, maybe he's a Russian spy, so weird. But Gurdjieff finally gets a place in France.
With a lot of financial help from Ouspensky.
I was just going to say, you just read my mind. Here it is, live. You just read my mind. Yeah, and mostly through the contributions that Ouspensky was able to get from people in London, and he knew some very wealthy and influential people who had the money to do this and who believed in his work and all that. And so, and he always worked as, he always helped Gurdjieff. He always helped Gurdjieff. And in many ways, he stayed, in the background doing this and all that. In fact, the story is Gurdjieff stole all of his students. Orage went, Nicole went, so many other people went that were in Ouspensky's group, and they all went over to France, to his prairie in Fontainebleau, which is outside of Paris. And that he sets that up, and that's going, but it only in like a couple years it starts, things stop. And Gurdjieff has this car accident, and the idea that he had an accident in the first place, even though he's notoriously a horrible driver. People were, they had fear for their life if they ever, went for a ride with him. But he was supposed to be outside the law of accident because he was awake. Those who aren't awake, they're still within the law of accident. And so because we're not awake, we're still subject to chance and all this sort of thing. But he's awake, so he's outside of that. But then, when you actually look at the accident, like what happened, they find him sort of away from the car. He was driving his Peugeot, and he smashed it into a tree on the route from Paris to Fontainebleau. And he told his secretary, don't, who usually drove with him, don't come in the car today. Take the train back. And the day before, he had everything checked in the car, and the brakes and the steering and everything kind of double checked and all that. And when they find him, he's off to the side of the road, laid out, has a cushion under his head, just like someone has put him there. And they can't understand how they found him like that. The car is totaled. He's all scarred, and it's a very bad accident, and he's hurt very badly. And for a while, they're wondering whether he's going to survive or not. And it takes quite a long time for him to recover and recuperate. But somehow, two things. One is that he did it on purpose. There seems enough circumstantial evidence suggests, and Gurdjieff's the kind of man who would be able to do this, that he's somehow arranged the accident on purpose, so that he somehow got tired of the institute and he wanted to move on already or something like that. And so he wanted to basically get rid of the students, and having the accident was a way of doing that. or whatever, for some other reason too. Through the recuperative process, he managed to learn something and gain new strength, because he talks about stories like that in some of his writings. But another side is that Ouspensky starts to think, well, he's gone off the rails somehow. This is somehow a sign that he's gone wrong, and there's some dark forces are now working. And he's even thinking, is Gurdjieff going mad? Is he going? There's something there, and he's thinking, well, there's the teaching and then the teacher, and I can stick with the teaching, but there's something here I just can't. I can't understand, or I don't, feel comfortable with, or whatever. And they both sort of say, you have to pick one or the other. You can't have two teachers. So you're either with me, then you have to just forget about Gurdjieff, or vice versa, and all that. There's a separation, and it's a very different kind of thing that Ouspensky's doing than what Gurdjieff is doing. And then Gurdjieff starts to write his ideas, which is a completely other kettle of fish.
Gurdjieff wrote Tales of Beelzebub.
Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson.
Yeah.
Yes, and which, if you know it, it's an enormous book that is not an easy read. I mean, it's sort of compared to sort of a combination of Finnegan's Wake and Tristram Shandy, and after drinking quite a few vodkas to try and read this, because it's full of parenthetical clauses and dependent clauses and neologisms, and it's a real slog to get through it. And again, the stories is that either he's just a horrible writer, which can't be true, because if you read Meetings with Remarkable Men, is his other book. Well, there's three, but this is the second one. This is a very clear, lucid, account of his early years and his travels with his group called the Seekers of Truth, and in the Holy Lands, in Egypt and other places, and in search of ancient wisdom, as everyone was, and his account of finding the Sarmung Brotherhood, where he learned his ideas, and so on and so on. That's wonderfully, clearly, straightforwardly written. So he can write clearly. So he's writing in this sort of potholed way. It's like driving up a road where there's lots of potholes in it. You kind of have to either go through them, up and down, or around them, and all that kind of thing. And it's to make it difficult for the reader to be able to, get the real pith and all this kind of thing. So he's kind of set up all these booby traps to, I guess, get rid of the faint-hearted. That's the sort of thing. But he does that. And the story is that that's kind of circulated in manuscript, or copies of it. And it comes to Ouspensky's attention, and he just can't bring himself to read it. Or C.S. Knott, who was a student of Gurdjieff's and knew Ouspensky, and wrote two accounts of his time in the work. He talks of how he's in England in the 30s, and he's become friends with Ouspensky, and he's going to his own kind of institute he's got. He has his own place outside of London. And they're talking about Beelzebub and all this sort of thing. And, Ouspensky's had a copy for a while, and not asked him if he read it. And he said, no, I can't. I try to read it, and it sticks in my throat, kind of thing. And knowing the book, one can say, well, in one sense, yes, it isn't a page turn. It certainly isn't In Search of the Miraculous, which is absolutely lucid and clear, but that's not Gurdjieff's intention. Yeah. The difficulty that is made, this kind of, purpose of difficulty, is enough to stop Ouspensky. But then I could also feel like, Gurdjieff wrote an earlier thing called The Herald of Coming Good. That is this mad kind of text. It's this weird kind of surrealist text that even he thought was too weird after he published it, and he got all the copies back and destroyed most of them. And when Ouspensky read that, he thought that yes, he's gone off the rails out of his mind. So they're very, very different people, and in the end, they're just very, very different people. And I say in the book, for all his brilliance, and I recognize Gurdjieff as one of the great psychologists of, modern age, and obviously the great esoteric teacher as well. But I think he misunderstood Ouspensky in important ways. And I also think Ouspensky sort of misunderstood himself in some ways, by putting aside this other part of himself in order to somehow meet this kind of, this austere Spartan kind of demand of Gurdjieff's. Even though I think he learned things from that. And he says towards the end of In Search of Miraculous that he felt that he had something, something did start to solidify in him from all the work. And, he tells stories about he had his own adventures when they were separated during the Civil War, and he had to think quickly, and he had to, think on his feet and be able to deal with situations. And, that he felt that what he had learned was enabled him to do that. So I think he did get something from it, but other things too is like he sort of isolated himself too much. I mean, when he was here in London in the 30s, J.B. Priestley, who was a very, very world famous writer at the time, he's not as read today, but he was another time haunted man. He's famous for his play Time in the Conways and I Have Been Here Before, and the whole idea of time. He wrote a fantastic book in the early 60s called Man and Time. And one of his plays is based on Ouspensky's time theories in New Model of the Universe. And he even says it in the play. He even says it in the playbill for when it was on the West End, whatever theater it was in. And he tried to meet Ouspensky, but Ouspensky wouldn't meet. He kept to himself. He was very isolated. I guess maybe years of living in Russia or something, or being uprooted too many times or something. But he got this huge place out of London called Lyne Place, and it was a big estate, a big mansion, and he kind of lived out there on his own. And he had the groups going on there, and his wife was more or less kind of running them, and she was more like a Gurdjieffian kind of character. And apparently, she was quite the grand dame and all that kind of thing. And he's kind of off to himself. And what he did a lot in his last days was study the New Testament and different translations of the New Testament. And again, this is something where Gurdjieff drops a clue in Search of the Miraculous, where he sort of says, well, what we're doing is really esoteric Christianity, but it's Christianity before Christianity. And a kind of veiled reference, I would take it to sort of Hermeticism and that kind of thing. But Ouspensky spent his last years, many of his last years, going through different sort of translations of the New Testament. And again, he has a wonderful essay on Christianity in the New Testament in New Model of the Universe. So I think it's a shame that he's only known as, Gurdjieff's brightest student, and that these other works aren't as well known, because they're very much of their time, but they're very, very readable. And they still, for me at least, they're still able to evoke this sense of awe and mystery that I first got from them when I first read them 40-something years ago.
You speculate in your book that two things I think of great interest. One is that Gurdjieff would never have become a world teacher as he is now recognized without the help and support of Ouspensky on the one hand, and on the other hand, you suggest that even though his encounter with Gurdjieff was probably the most significant event of his life, Ouspensky might have had an even greater career if he had never met Gurdjieff.
I think he sort of says that himself. I think one of the things, the stories is in his last days, he was taken around to all the places that he knew in London, in England, that were important to him, because he wanted to remember them, so that when he came around next time, somehow, he would be able to remember the next recurrence. And one can't help but wonder, what this would mean for his encounter with Gurdjieff, because he does talk about crossroads. There are these sort of crossroads in your life when you have an opportunity, if you remember in that recurrence, to be able to change things. And, would he have accepted that invitation to go see, meet this certain G? I mean, he doesn't even name Gurdjieff in Search of the Miraculous. It's just G, and it wasn't even supposed to be called In Search of the Miraculous. The title he had is Fragments of a Forgotten Teaching or something like that, but it was too close to a book by G.R.S. Mead about Gnosticism that had a similar title. And luckily the editors, gave it the right title. But no, I think you're right. And one of the honors or best things for me to come from writing this book is that I got a letter from Tanya Negro, who was Ouspensky's granddaughter, sort of step-granddaughter. And she said that, thank you for writing this book. And I think without, my grandfather's, contribution, Gurdjieff wouldn't, be as well known, basically, or been able to be as successful as he was. And that's just what you said. And I think that's true. And I think that's why he, singled him out. I mean, he had other sort of lieutenants too, as well. I mean, Raj, who I mentioned a couple of times, who's a fantastic literary editor here, he discovered Catherine Mansfield and some other people, and he was the editor of this journal called The New Age in the early 20th century, and it published a wide variety of stuff. But he, went and basically converted to, Gurdjieff's teaching. He started out in Ouspensky's groups, and then he went to Fontainebleau, and he said, well, Ouspensky knows the stuff, but Gurdjieff isn't, basically. He's, he's being and all that kind of thing. And he devoted his life to that. And Gurdjieff sent him to America. He was sort of his American agent, and Gurdjieff went to America a few times, Raj had many groups there and all that. And other people, J.G. Bennett. He tried to snare Nicol, but Nicol liked Ouspensky. So Nicol stayed with Ouspensky and developed a whole, groups here and all that kind of thing. I think it's because he's, look, I'll be called a heretic or something for this, but I think, Gurdjieff said, the first book to read is Beelzebub, and I think anyone who's given Beelzebub to be the first book to read to try and get interested in Gurdjieff is, you're being handed a hand grenade. I mean, it's not going to do it. There's a story Colin Wilson tells, and when he was a young man here in London, and he had met an intellectual who he was visiting, and they discussed ideas and all this kind of thing. And he talked to him about Gurdjieff because he had just found In Search of the Miraculous in the Wembley Library or something like that, and was reading it. And he was talking to him about it, and the fellow said, okay, well, what should I read if I want to know more about it? And he said, well, you should get one of these introductory books like In Search of Miraculous, and there's a book by Kenneth Walker called Adventure with Ideas that was published around the same time. And he said, no, I have to go straight to the source. I don't want secondhand. I want to go straight to the source. And so he went and got a copy of Beelzebub, and he said, this is just gibberish. I can't understand this at all. This was somebody who's very intelligent. So I think that kind of preparation that you get from Search of Miraculous is, you can't get it anywhere else. And yes, it's a particular way of teaching from a particular time, and I know there's all different sorts of things, and Gurdjieff was doing very, very different things when he was in Paris in his flat, and the toasts to the idiots and all that sort of thing. But you still get the basic ideas there, and if you're attracted to them there, then certainly you'll go in search of the miraculous in the other books as well.
Now let's talk about that, the toast to the idiots, or the toast of the idiots, because I'm of the impression that Gurdjieff frequently regarded everyone else around him as an idiot.
Yeah, well, I guess if you go back to the original idea of the term, it means sort of unique. It means like your idiosyncrasies. It's what makes you. So there's something, and there was different grades or different kinds of idiots, particular sorts of idiots. I don't remember all the names right now, but one of the things that he would do in Paris in the 40s during the occupation and also before was he had a small flat near the Arc de Triomphe, and he would have these huge gatherings of people who would come for these lunches that would go on forever. He'd have like 50 people in some tiny flat where he would be preparing this huge feast, and they'd just be crammed there doing that. And then before the food, you would have these shots of vodka. And Gurdjieff, though he wasn't particularly interested in drugs, although he did experiment them and knew about them, he certainly used alcohol to sort of loosen up people's personality. He said, the alcohol gets to the essence. And this is something that's very Russian too, So, I mean, although Gurdjieff was in Russia, he kind of came out of Russia. He's sort of Greek-Armenian background. But, and this was something that, you would have different shots, and there'd be different toasts, and Gurdjieff would sort of say which idiot you were. And this was kind of like a teaching strategy, or it was some kind of thing. And you were supposed, why am I that kind of idiot, and what sort of thing, and sort of thing. And this was something that some people who went there once or twice, they people like Kenneth Walker, he tells a story about going there, and he was sort of teetotal, but, he did it because he had to do it. And it wasn't something that he wanted to, sort of do again. And then Robert Estorop, who wrote a book famous in the 60s called The Master Game, and another earlier book called Drugs in the Mind and autobiography Warrior's Way. He was involved in Gurdjieff's group for a while with Ouspensky in New York, and then he also did visit Gurdjieff in this flat in Paris in France, and he was turned off by all the alcohol and all the kind of rich foods and all this, the tobacco, the smoking and all that. He was, I guess, kind of getting into the California, health kind of thing. So there's some people involved who were turned off by that. But this was something that was supposed to be a remarkable thing to be at these gatherings. And Gurdjieff was able to create a kind of atmosphere. And, he had mana. I mean, I think in some ways, I think he and Jung were similar. They had this kind of larger than life, man's man, kind of vital, rooted, earthy kind of character to them. And Jung was a good cook as well. And things happened around Jung, things somehow, emanations out of his own psyche, the pots and pans rattled and things like that. And so I think it was a similar kind of thing where they both had this kind of power in some way. And just to be around it, you could feel it. So, yes, I think, Gurdjieff was able to create this kind of atmosphere. And Ouspensky didn't have that. He wasn't charismatic like that. He was an ideas man. He wasn't very good in front. He wasn't a lecturer, although, he could read and write English very well. He spoke with a very thick Russian accent. I mean, Gurdjieff spoke about 5 languages at the same time, and sort of it got across somehow. So they were very different kinds of characters, and so it's understandable that people who are attracted to Ouspensky's mind, his ideas, but then they would meet Gurdjieff, they would feel like, well, this is the source. This is where it really comes from.
Now, you describe Ouspensky as being really greatly disillusioned at the end of his life, although you point out that his student at the time who accompanied him in his last days, Rodney Collin, had a very different view. So Ouspensky is entering a kind of saintly, almost a beatification toward the end of his life.
Yeah, I mean, there's different ways of looking at Ouspensky's last days. I mean, one story is, as I said, that he himself wanted to go on all these sort of long, automobile journeys to different places of England that he knew, and so he could remember and all that. And him making all these efforts when he was a really, really sick man. It was basically sort of kidney failure, I think, from drinking too much. He had spent quite a few years staying up late at night, reminiscing about the good old days back in Russia. I mean, he was very Russian, and that you have to remember too. He's very Russian, very sentimental. Here's the balalaikas, and I don't mean to diminish it, but you have to remember he was, like he said, and he did grow up, in the tavern and all that kind of thing. And so there he is, isolated in this kind of community by himself. His relationships with his wife and are not very good, and so she was a very serious, strict, kind of character, commanding, dominant kind of character. And he could be, they say he could shout Moscow style. He could be tough and dominant when it needed to be, but that wasn't really his style. He was much more gentle, really, and introverted, and someone who was interested in ideas and pursuing them and all that kind of thing. And I think he basically, he just wanted to be alone and not be really a part so much of all the activities that went on, because I guess they found that just having the lectures and just having the talks and the theories wasn't enough, and like Gurdjieff did, they incorporated different sorts of physical activities on these the places that he had. So it was like farm work and carpentry and all this kind of thing. And while you're doing these things, you're doing these practices of self-remembering and observation and a variety of other things. And you're also interacting with other people. That's another part of it too. It has to be done in a group. You can't really do it on your own because you can't see your blind side. You can't see the areas of yourself that you're unconscious of, you're not aware of. Others can see them. And through the friction produced by people being around, we come to see, those parts of ourselves. So you have to be open to that kind of intentional suffering too. You have to be able to put yourself through someone pointing out, where you're being a jerk, basically, that kind of thing. And Ouspensky wasn't really part of that. He was, off on his own, and he would have a couple friends around, and one of them was Rodney Collin, who was someone who started out too. He was a journalist, and he was part of the kind of peace movement that people like Aldous Huxley and Gerald Hurd were involved in the 30s before World War II. And somehow through that connection that he had heard about Ouspensky's groups, and he got involved in London, and then later followed him to New York, and was in New Jersey at this place Franklin Farms as well. And then went back when Ouspensky went back in 1947. Spent his last few months back in London. He went as well, and he died in this place called Lyme Place, which is in an area called Virginia Water outside of London, and he's buried there. And I visited there with my partner back a couple summers, and we saw the grave and all that. It's very modest, and it just has his name. It's in Russian and in English. But the story is that the other version of the story is that Rodney Collins sort of made him do all these things, kind of like forced him to go and have these sort of moments. So either that Ouspensky would himself remember, or somehow he wanted it to be a miracle in some way. It couldn't just be that here's a tired, sick, ill man who sort of really feels like he's made a mistake, over many years of his life, and he's come to see that. And I think in the end he did have this kind of searing honesty where he just felt like, well, this hasn't worked. This hasn't worked for me. I'm not where I thought I was going to be by following this path. And I shouldn't teach it anymore, and I want to free, these people from it. Or you could see it as, okay, here's one last shock, delivered. What do you do now? I'm not going to be around anymore. So you're left on your own. Most of them went over to Gurdjieff in France for the last couple of years of his life. Again, this whole psychodrama story. What is it really going on? Is this something? And Rodney Collins looks at it in a big, broad, esoteric way, as kind of like reenacting something along the lines of, like the Last Supper or something like that. He sees it in this kind of mythic kind of way, and so again, it depends how you want to look at it. But I don't know if see, the thing with Ouspensky with eternal recurrence, he's already back in his life, so he's not in our life now, but he's gone back into his life, and so. I don't know, maybe he's figured it out this time. I hope so.
Well, Gary, you were involved in the Gurdjieff work for several years, and in the most recent edition of your book, you conclude with an appendix describing your own experience, and I gather, well, perhaps you could put it in your own words better than me.
Well, it happened in the early 1980s in New York. Strangely enough, I discovered someone, a friend of mine who I was sharing a flat with. I knew he was interested in this sort of thing, and he knew I was interested in it too. But I had gone to a lecture on the Gurdjieff work at somewhere at the Barbizon Hotel or something like that, and I just come back and mentioned it, and he sort of said to me, "Oh no, that's not the real thing. Those people are bogus or something like that." And he said, "If you really want to know the real thing, call this." And I thought, "What is this? Out of nowhere, you're telling me now call this number about getting involved in the Gurdjieff sort of thing." So I wound up calling the number, and it was a legitimate group from the Gurdjieff Foundation, and going back in the history and all that, and. Yes, I got involved there. The person who was the leader, the group leader that I was involved with there, he was one of the sort of principal sort of teachers of the movements. I later came to understand that. And we met, I don't know, we met up in a basement sort of space up in the Upper West Side in New York once a week, and basically discussed the ideas, sort of had readings, and then discussed our experiences, practicing the exercises and things of that sort. But then I moved to Los Angeles not too long after that, in 1982, and I got involved in it more there. And as I talk about in the book, I had some, very memorable, deep, and moving experiences. I mentioned something earlier about practicing the movements. That was one of them. I had the kind of usual Gurdjieff treatment where I remember once being asked to paint a fence. And, I thought I did a pretty good job. And then they came around and said, oh, no, it's not the right color. I said, well, that was the color you told me to paint it. And creating this kind of, conflict, this different kind of thing where you sort of have to, okay, well, you have to deal with the mechanicalness of your own reactions to the situation, and a variety of other things, and readings from Beelzebub, readings from Search for the Miraculous, and group meals, and doing all different kinds of work. So it was all it was very much active in the sense that you're involved doing things, and what you're doing, the work itself you're doing, may not be particularly important or interesting. It's it's observation of yourself as you're doing it, and it's becoming more aware of your mechanicalness of your sleep. And I can remember at one point just doing something simple as raking leaves and all that, where I really felt that what are these things in my hand, and these wet, lovely, glistening kind of things, what are they? And that sort of childlike feeling of your first time looking at something like that. And it sounds cliche, but I still have a real strong sense of that feeling, and that that was a product of all the exercises and practices and what was happening at the time. But in the long run, for myself, because I was interested in lots of other things. I have a very eclectic kind of mind, and I like to check out lots of things and make connections and put things together. This was, sort of not the thing to do. It was kind of like, well, you're studying this, and it makes sense. You're studying this teaching. You've come here to learn this. You've come here to learn geometry, not something else. But that's what we're teaching. So, but I just found in the end that, to be honest with myself, and there were different things. Some of the things we talked about here, I started to question some of the kind of well, especially, I said, even as early as that, I was beginning questioning sort of this relationship between Ouspensky and Gurdjieff and what that was all about. And I did find myself more and more drawn to Ouspensky's kind of approach to it, put it that way, or just in general kind of, this sort of philosophical ideas that he was exploring, rather than the kind of tactic or strategies that were being, used in the group. And my understanding, I didn't know this at the time, but my understanding was that there was a decision when, back sort of after like Maurice Nicoll died, and the groups that he was involved with here and whatever came from them started to sort of peter out. And sort of the kind of official line, I mean, this is just sort of, something that I've heard, so I don't know how strict this history is. But so the official line came to be like, well, we're not doing that. We're not doing that kind of thing. We're sticking to this sort of thing. And it's more, Gurdjieff's own kind of approach. So we're not incorporating the kinds of things that Nicoll did and that kind of thing. And I just found myself more attracted to that than to the other. And so I just decided, well, I should be honest with myself and with them, and drop out of it. So I did. And there's no hard feelings. And I feel like I learned a lot from it. And I still have nothing but respect, for Gurdjieff and Ouspensky and for the people that have, tried to understand and explore his teachings.
Given the enormous influence that the Gurdjieff work still has in our culture, it deserves study and it deserves respect. But I have to say, when I read that appendix you wrote, it seemed to me as if you were kind of agreeing with Ouspensky's disillusionment, that you didn't, after several years involved in that work, you got some things out of it for sure, but not what you felt had been expected or had been promised.
I hate to talk about my level and all that, because, my God, I'm as unconscious as everybody, and I'm no master at any of this whatsoever. But I did feel, after doing a lot of the practices, that I got to some point and it wasn't going anywhere with it. And when I would bring that up, it would be kind of like, well, okay, well, just stay there kind of thing. And again, just being my mind as it is, I just was aware of lots of other things. And I was very much into Colin Wilson's work at this, and had been. I mean, in fact, his little book on Gurdjieff, The War Against Sleep, which I read, came out in 1980, and I read that. And I also had read James Webb's huge study, The Harmonious Circle, around the same time. And these were books that led me towards, okay, if I'm reading about this, studying it, I should actually try to do it at some point. But some of Colin Wilson's reservations about Gurdjieff's approach stayed with me as well. And so I just felt like Ouspensky said himself, if at some point you think, this is a good way, but it's not my way. It's not the way itself isn't bad, but it's not the way I should go. And this was something that he felt himself after about 1920 or so, when we'd already been with Gurdjieff for quite some time. And he stayed, and he helped him. He did a variety of different things. They tried to work together, but in the end, he felt like, well, this is just not. And in the end, you just have to trust yourself, I guess. Otherwise, you're just always thinking, well. And the whole point of these things is to get you to trust yourself, isn't it? It's get you to sort of trust your own feelings,
Well, just by way of disclosure, I was also involved in the Gurdjieff group briefly in 1969. I was quite interested, and I attended a meeting, and they gave me an exercise. They said they wanted me to write an essay on the difference between essence and personality, which you talked about earlier. And I came back to the second meeting, and I hadn't written the essay, and they said, "You're too lazy for all of this. Goodbye. We don't want you anymore." So that was my experience.
Well, hey, who knows? It could have been good. I mean, what I tend to do, because I've been on the show quite a few times. I write about different people, and I see connections between them. And to me, it's more important to see the connections between them rather than we have the truth, and only this way, and if you don't follow this way, there's no salvation outside the church or something like that. I mean, I can understand the need to keep your integrity and keep your identity, but I think at this point it's more important to be able to see connections between these things. Just like I said before, and I was talking about this whole idea of second wind and the Gurdjieff movement pushing you into, pushing past your limits and breaking into what he calls the accumulators. We have these sort of things that carry our tanks of energy, basically. And there's a small one we use for everyday things, and we think, oh, I'm exhausted, but if some emergency comes up, we can tap into the other one, and so on and so on. So seeing connections between all that stuff makes me feel like, well, this is real. It's about something real. And I don't care if it comes from the Sarmung Brotherhood or if it comes from Gurdjieff's own very fertile mind. And I suspect it's, I don't know, 70-30, I don't know, 60-40. But it doesn't matter. The source of it to me isn't what's important. I mean, that's the kind of aura of the esoteric aura, and this is the real tradition, that kind of thing. And I'm not particularly interested in that. I'm pragmatic. I'm saying, well, does it work? Does it? And I think it does work. At least in that context, I can see it. The other side of it becomes a whole way of life kind of thing. And that's the other, and again, I'm nothing against people who do that, but that's not something I'm ever been sort of attracted to, where you have your whole aesthetic, your whole everything around you somehow is connected or a part or emanates that. And I have too much interest to have any one thing. It's just a grab bag of tons of stuff back here. So
well, I think you and I probably share that in common.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
Well, Gary, once again, this has been a fascinating conversation, insightful about a very important esoteric movement that's still having an enormous impact today. Thank you for being with me.
Absolutely, and thank you for having me on again.
It's a great pleasure, and I look forward to more.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue number 8 of the new Thinking Aloud magazine, or order a beautiful printed copy. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.